The flatline tone didn't sound like it does in the movies. It wasn't a clean electronic hum. It was a jagged, piercing shriek that tore through the trauma bay, drowning out the panic in the nurse's voice. The boy on the table was only 19. His chest was cracked open, ribs held apart by steel spreaders, revealing a heart that had simply decided to stop fighting. Dr. Aris Thorne threw his latex gloves onto the floor, splattering blood across the pristine white shoes of the med student standing in the corner. Thorne didn't look at the grieving mother screaming in the hallway. He didn't look at the clock to call the time of death. He looked at his reflection in the glass of the supply cabinet, checking his hair, adjusting his collar. "Anatomy failure," Thorne muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. The kid's physiology was a mess. Nothing to be done. It was a lie. Everyone in the room knew it was a lie. Thorne had nicked the artery because he was rushing, because he was bragging about his golf swing to the anesthesiologist while holding a scalpel inside a human chest. But nobody said a word. In the hierarchy of Saint Jude's trauma center, Aris Thorne was a god, and gods do not make mistakes. They only have unlucky worshippers. In the back corner, overshadowed by the swinging doors and the chaos, Elara Vance stood perfectly still. She held a tray of sterilized instruments, her knuckles white against the metal. She was 52 years old, with a thick streak of iron-gray hair cutting through a messy bun, and deep, jagged burn scars wrapping around her left forearm like a bracelet of old wire. She had seen the nick. She had seen the exact moment Thorne's ego outweighed his skill. She had stepped forward, opening her mouth to speak, but the charge nurse had shoved her back into the shadows with a sharp elbow. "Stay back, newbie," the charge nurse had hissed. "You clean up. You don't speak." So Elara cleaned. That was her role. She was the agency nurse, the temp, the woman who had arrived 2 weeks ago with a resume full of gaps and a demeanor so quiet she seemed to vanish when she stopped moving. She walked with a stiff, rhythmic gait, favoring her right leg, a tick-tock cadence that echoed down the empty corridors on the night shift. The staff at Saint Jude's didn't bother to learn her name. To them, she was just the ghost. She was the one who restocked the crash carts, emptied the bedpans, and took the vitals of the patients the doctors found boring. They mocked her silence in the break room. They laughed at how her hands would sometimes tremble when she held a coffee cup, whispering that she was probably a washout, a recovering addict who had burned out of a nursing home somewhere in the Midwest. "She moves like she's underwater," Nurse Jana said, loud enough for Elara to hear as she scrubbed the blood from the floor of Trauma 1. Jana was young, bright, and viciously ambitious, the kind of nurse who flirted with the residents and rolled her eyes at the patients. I asked her for a 16-gauge IV yesterday and she just looked at me for 5 seconds before moving. It's creepy. Why did HR even hire her? "Budget cuts," Thorne laughed, stepping over Elara's hand as she scrubbed the linoleum. "You get what you pay for. Just make sure she doesn't touch the VIPs. I don't want her depressing aura ruining my outcome stats." Elara didn't look up. She focused on the red swirl in the soapy water. She didn't tell them that her hands only trembled when she was idle. She didn't tell them that the 5-second pause wasn't confusion, but assessment. She didn't tell them that she had seen things that would make Aris Thorne vomit in his expensive loafers. She just scrubbed. The shift wore on, heavy and humid. The air conditioning in the older wing of the hospital was failing, making the air stick to the skin. The tension in the ER was palpable, a tightly wound spring waiting to snap. Then, the radio at the nurse's station crackled. The static cut through the low murmur of the waiting room. "Inbound. ETA. 3 minutes. Military transport. This is a code black. Repeat. Code black." Code black wasn't a standard medical term. It was a Saint Jude special. It meant high value. It meant cameras, press, and politics. The double doors at the ambulance bay blew open, not from the wind, but from the rotor wash of a helicopter landing dangerously close to the building. The sound was deafening, a thumping heartbeat that rattled the windows in their frames. A gurney came crashing through the entrance, flanked by 2 men in dark suits and earpieces who moved with the aggression of guard dogs. On the stretcher lay a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and then dropped from a cliff. Commander Breaker Kincaid. Even covered in grime and dried mud, he was instantly recognizable. The local hero, the Navy SEAL who had been on every news channel for the last month, the poster boy for American resilience. He was conscious, his eyes wild and scanning the ceiling. Teeth gritted against a pain he refused to vocalize. His right leg was a mess of makeshift tourniquets and field dressings, soaked through with dark, venous blood. "Get out of the way," Thorne shouted, shoving a resident aside. This was his moment. This was the patient that got you on the evening news. Trauma 1. Move. I want full labs, cross-match, and get the ortho team on standby. The energy in the room shifted instantly. It went from lethargic to electric. Everyone wanted to be close to the hero. Everyone wanted to be part of the story. Elara was pushed to the perimeter, her back pressed against the cold tile wall. She watched the frenzy. She watched Thorne lean over the SEAL, putting on his best compassionate savior face. "Commander Kincaid, I'm Dr. Thorne. You're at Saint Jude's. I'm going to take care of you. We've got the best team in the state." Breaker Kincaid grabbed Thorne's wrist. The grip was strong enough to turn the doctor's knuckles white. "My leg," Kincaid growled, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Don't. Cut it. We're going to do everything we can." Thorne soothed, already motioning for the sedation. "Just relax, Commander." Elara's eyes narrowed. She wasn't looking at the leg. The leg was ugly, sure, a mangle of torn muscle and shattered bone. But it wasn't what was killing him. She was looking at his neck. The veins were distended, roping out against the tanned skin like blue cords. His breathing wasn't just labored from pain, it was paradoxical. His chest was rising, but his abdomen was sinking. She took a step forward. The tremble in her hand vanished. "He's not ventilating," Elara said. Her voice was low, raspy, unused. Nobody heard her. The room was a cacophony of orders and machine alarms. Thorne was busy cutting away the pant leg, exposing the gruesome injury for the nurses to gasp at. "Look at that tissue damage," Thorne announced, performing for his audience. "We need to debride this immediately, or he loses the limb. Prep the ore." Elara stepped closer, breaking the invisible barrier of the unimportant staff. She saw the sweat on Kincaid's forehead turn cold and clammy. She saw the grey pallor spreading beneath his tan. "Doctor," Elara said, louder this time, "check his trachea. It's deviated." Thorne stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing in irritation. The room went silent. The great Dr. Thorne had been interrupted by the janitor nurse. "Excuse me?" Thorne said, his voice dripping with icy condescension. "Did you say something, Vance?" "He has a tension pneumothorax," Elara stated, her grey eyes locking onto Thorne's. "The blast injury didn't just hit his leg. His lung is collapsing. If you sedate him for surgery without decompression, you will kill him." Nurse Jana let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh my God, Elara. Go back to the supply closet. Dr. Thorne is the chief of trauma." "He's right here," Thorne sneered, gesturing to the monitor which showed a steady, elevated heart rate. O2 stats are 94%. "He's fine, Vance. He's in pain. Stop playing doctor and go empty the catheter bags." "The monitor is lagging," Elara insisted, her voice hard as steel. "Look at him. He's air-hungry. The pressure is shifting his mediastinum. You are about to cardiac arrest a national hero." Thorne's face turned red. To be challenged was bad. To be challenged by her, in front of a VIP patient and his security detail, was unforgivable. "Get her out of here," Thorne barked at the security guards. "She's disrupting a critical trauma. Get her out now." One of the suited men stepped forward, grabbing Elara's arm with a bruising grip. He began to drag her back toward the swinging doors. Elara didn't fight the grip, but she didn't look away from the patient. She looked at Breaker Kincaid, who was staring back at her, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization. He couldn't breathe. He was drowning in air. "Wait!" Kincaid tried to wheeze, but no sound came out. "You're making a mistake," Elara shouted as she was hauled backward. "Look at his neck. Look at the deviation. Sedation, Thorn yelled, drowning her out. Push 100 of propofol. Let's get this leg fixed. Elara was shoved through the double doors, stumbling into the hallway. The doors swung shut, cutting off her view. 3 seconds later, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor inside Trauma 1 changed. It didn't speed up. It didn't slow down. It stopped. The long, flat tone shrieked through the walls, exactly like the one that had played for the 19-year-old boy. Inside the room, the shouting began. Panic. Absolute chaos. Elara stood alone in the hallway, the fluorescent lights humming above her, staring at the closed doors as the sound of a dying man filled the air. The sound of the flatline wasn't just a noise. It was a verdict. It vibrated through the heavy fire doors, chilling the hallway where Elara stood. Inside Trauma 1, the shouting dissolved into the panicked, animalistic noise of a team that had lost control. No pulse. Start compressions. Thorn's voice cracked, an octave higher than his usual baritone command. Get the pads. Charge to 200. Elara didn't think. The decision wasn't conscious. It was a reflex burned into her nervous system decades ago, dormant but never extinguished. She spun on her heel, the rubber sole of her orthopedic shoe squeaking sharply against the linoleum. The security guard who had thrown her out was standing with his back to the door, hand on his earpiece, looking confused. He was big, built like a linebacker, but his stance was lazy. He expected compliance. He expected the middle-aged nurse to cry or walk away. He didn't expect her to move like a striking cobra. Elara stepped into his personal space before he registered her motion. She didn't punch him. That would have been messy. She jammed the rigid edge of her hand into the bundle of nerves just above his elbow, the ulnar nerve cluster. It was a precise, agonizing sting that forced his arm to go numb and useless. As he gasped, shocked by the sudden jolt of electricity shooting up his shoulder, Elara slammed her hip into his center of gravity, spinning him against the wall. He grunted, sliding down, temporarily paralyzed by confusion and pain. Elara didn't look back. She hit the door release and burst back into the room. The scene inside was a massacre of protocol. Thorn was standing over Kincaid, holding the defibrillator paddles, his face slick with sweat. Nurse Jana was frantically compressing Kincaid's chest, but her mechanics were wrong too fast, too shallow, panic driving her hands. "Clear!" Thorn screamed. "Stop!" Elara's voice was a thunderclap. It wasn't the voice of the quiet agency nurse. It was a command voice, projected from the diaphragm, designed to cut through gunfire and rotor wash. "You're killing him. It's not cardiac. It's obstructive." Thorn triggered the shock. Kincaid's body convulsed on the table, a violent, arching spasm. The monitor didn't change. The flat line whined on, indifferent and cruel. "Still flat. Charge again," Thorn yelled, eyes wild. "Why isn't he converting?" "Because his heart has no room to beat." Elara sprinted toward the crash cart. She didn't run like a nurse rushing to help. She moved with a predator's low center of gravity. She shoved Jana away from the cart with enough force to send the younger woman stumbling into the IV poles. "Hey!" Jana shrieked. "What are you doing? Security!" Elara ignored her. Her hands flew over the tray, bypassing the adrenaline, bypassing the intubation kit. She snatched a 14-gauge angiocath, a thick, long needle meant for rapid fluid resuscitation. She ripped the packaging open with her teeth, spitting the plastic onto the blood-slicked floor. Thorn turned, seeing her approach the patient with the needle. "Get away from him! You crazy bitch! Get away!" He lunged at her, raising the paddles like a weapon. Elara didn't flinch. She ducked under his wild swing, checking him with a hard shoulder to his ribs that knocked the wind out of him. Thorn stumbled back, crashing into the ventilator stand. The room froze. The residents, the med students, the remaining security detail, they all stared in paralyzed horror. The ghost had just assaulted the chief of trauma. Elara reached Kincaid. His face was now a deep, terrifying purple. His neck veins were bulging so hard they looked ready to burst. His chest on the right side was immobile, locked in a hyper-expanded state, crushing the heart and the left lung into uselessness. There was no time for iodine. No time for sterile draping. She palpated the chest wall. Her fingers, usually trembling, were now rock steady. They found the landmark instantly. The second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. "Forgive me, sailor," she whispered. She drove the needle down. She didn't push it gently. She punched it through the skin, through the muscle, and punched through the parietal pleura. "Pfft. Oh!" The sound was loud enough to be heard over the flatline tone. It was a violent, angry hiss, like a tire blowing out, as the trapped air, under massive pressure, finally found an escape route. The relief was instantaneous. Kincaid's chest collapsed on the right side as the air rushed out. The color began to flood back into his face, shifting from purple to pale gray. And then, the sound that changed everything. Beep. The monitor hiccuped. Beep. Beep. A jagged, stumbling rhythm appeared on the screen. Sinus tachycardia. Fast, but alive. A pulse. Kincaid drew in a ragged, desperate breath. His first real air in 3 minutes. His eyes flew open. They were bloodshot, terrified, and focused solely on the woman hovering over him with a bloody needle in her hand. For a second, the room was silent, save for the hiss of the escaping air and the steadying beep of the monitor. Then the spell broke. "She stabbed him!" Jana screamed, pointing a trembling finger. "She stabbed the patient!" The security guard from the hallway, now recovered and joined by 2 others, burst into the room. They didn't see a life-saving procedure. They saw a deranged temp nurse standing over a VIP with a weapon, the chief of trauma on the floor, and the room in shambles. "Get her down! Get her down now!" 3 men hit Elara at once. She didn't fight them. The adrenaline that had allowed her to act was already fading, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. She let them tackle her, her face smashed into the hard linoleum, the smell of floor wax and antiseptic filling her nose. A heavy knee pressed into her back, pinning her down. "Cuff her." Thorne scrambled to his feet, humiliated and enraged, clutching his side. "She assaulted me. She performed an unauthorized invasive procedure. I want her arrested right now." Elara felt the cold steel of the handcuffs bite into her wrists. Her cheek was pressed against the cold floor, her gaze fixed sideways. She wasn't looking at Thorne. She wasn't looking at the guards. From her vantage point on the floor, through the forest of legs and dropped equipment, she saw the gurney. Breaker Kincaid had turned his head. He was fighting the oxygen mask, straining against the straps. He was looking down at the floor, looking at her. His gaze wasn't angry. It was confused, intense, and searching. He watched as they jerked her to her feet, his chest rising and falling with the beautiful, rhythmic motion of a man who could breathe again. "Get her out of my hospital," Thorne spat, wiping spittle from his lip. "And call the police. I'm pressing charges." As they dragged Elara backward, her shoulder throbbing where the guard grabbed her, she didn't say a word. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain the physiology of a tension pneumothorax. She just went limp, letting them haul her away, her eyes dead and hollow once more. She had saved the life. That was the job. But as the doors swung shut, sealing her fate, she knew the truth. Elara Vance, the invisible woman, was dead. The ghost was gone, and whatever nightmare she had been running from for 10 years had just found a way to catch up. The back of a police cruiser smells of stale sweat and industrial disinfectant, a scent that triggers a primal, fight-or-flight response in most people. For Elara, it smelled like defeat. She sat with her knees pressed against the hard plastic partition, her hands cuffed behind her back, cutting off the circulation to her thumbs. She didn't look out the window at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement of the hospital driveway. She looked down at the rip in her scrub pants, the result of the security guard's tackle. "Name?" the officer in the front seat asked, not turning around. He was typing into a laptop terminal, the blue glow illuminating his bored expression. "Elara Vance," she said softly. "Date of birth?" She hesitated. A fraction of a second too long. The 12th of May, 1972. The officer paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You sure about that?" "You took a moment." "I'm sure," she whispered. She wasn't, of course. Elara Vance was a construct, a paper identity built on a dead woman's social security number and a forged nursing license from a defunct college in Oregon. It had held up for 6 years. It had allowed her to eat, to rent a basement apartment, to exist in the margins of society. Now, because she had decided to save a man who couldn't breathe, that existence was being shredded. They would run her prints at the station. When they did, Elara Vance would evaporate, and the woman beneath the woman the government had stopped looking for a decade ago would be exposed. Inside the hospital, the machinery of the institution was already grinding into motion to cover the wound. Commander Kincaid woke up in the ICU. The world was a blur of white light and chrome. His chest felt like it had been kicked by a mule, but the desperate, drowning sensation was gone. He took a breath. It hurt, but the air went deep. He blinked, trying to clear the fog of sedation. Standing at the foot of his bed was Dr. Aris Thorne, looking polished and composed, his white coat crisp, the bloodstains from the trauma bay gone. Beside him stood a woman in a sharp navy suit, holding a tablet like a shield. "Commander Kincaid," Thorne said, his voice smooth, practiced, oozing false warmth. "Welcome back. You gave us quite a scare." Kincaid tried to sit up, but his body refused. He licked his dry lips. "The nurse." Thorne's smile didn't falter, but his eyes tightened. "Yes, I'm terribly sorry about that incident. Security handled it. We had a temporary staff member who suffered a psychotic break during your triage. It's unfortunate, but we stabilized you despite her interference." Kincaid narrowed his eyes. The drugs made him heavy, but they didn't make him stupid. He remembered the fear in the room. He remembered Thorne freezing. He remembered the woman with the grey hair and the scarred arm. She hadn't been psychotic. She had been precise. She put a needle in my chest, Kincaid rasped. "She assaulted you," the woman in the suit corrected him. Her voice was clipped, efficient. "I'm Mrs. Vesson, Hospital Risk Management." That woman performed an unauthorized, invasive procedure with a non-sterile instrument. "She nicked your lung pleura." Dr. Thorne had to go in and repair the damage immediately after security removed her. "You're lucky to be alive, Commander." Kincaid looked from Vesson to Thorne. It was a narrative, a clean, legal narrative designed to protect the hospital from a lawsuit and the chief of trauma from a scandal. She said, "Tension pneumothorax." Kincaid grunted, forcing the words out. Thorne chuckled, a dismissive sound. "She shouted a lot of things. That's the nature of a breakdown. Look, Breaker, can I call you Breaker? The important thing is that my team got you into surgery. We fixed the leg, and we re-expanded the lung properly. You're going to be fine. The press is downstairs. We're going to issue a statement in an hour saying you're stable." "Where is she?" Kincaid asked. "Police custody," Vesson answered instantly. "She's being charged with assault with a deadly weapon, practicing medicine without a license, and battery on hospital staff. She won't ever work in healthcare again." Kincaid closed his eyes. The image of the woman burned behind his eyelids. He remembered the grip of her hand on his shoulder, not frantic, but anchoring. He remembered the way she moved. He had spent 20 years in the SEAL teams. He knew the difference between a panicked amateur and a quiet professional. That woman moved like an operator. "I want to see the police report," Kincaid said, opening his eyes. Thorne sighed, checking his Rolex. "Commander, you need rest. We can discuss the legalities later. Right now, your job is to heal. My job is to make sure the world knows you're okay." Thorne patted the bed rail, a condescending gesture, and turned to leave, Vesson trailing him like a shadow. "Thorne," Kincaid growled. The doctor stopped at the door. "If she was crazy," Kincaid said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "Why am I breathing better than I was before she touched me?" Thorne's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. He just walked out, the heavy ICU door sealing the room in silence. Down at the 4th precinct, The fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing buzz. Elara sat in the holding cell. Her shoelaces had been taken. Her belt was gone. She felt small, stripped of the armor she had worn for so long. A detective walked in. He was older, tired, with a coffee stain on his tie. His badge read Det, Raker. He pulled a metal chair up to the bars and sat down with a heavy sigh. "So, Elara," Raker said, flipping open a notebook. "Or whatever your name is. We have a problem." Elara stared at her hands. "I told you my name." "Yeah, you did. But the fingerprints tell a different story." Raker tapped the paper in front of him. "I ran your prints through the local database. Nothing. Then I ran them through the state. Nothing. Usually, a nurse has prints on file for licensing. You don't. That's weird." He leaned in, the metal chair legs scraping the concrete. "So then, just for kicks, I sent them to the feds. FBI, DHS. Elara's heart stopped. This was it. The wall she had built was crumbling. And guess what? Raker continued, his eyes searching hers. The system flagged them, but it didn't give me a name. It gave me a contact, immediately notification for the Department of Defense. It said, restricted access, level 5. Raker looked at the middle-aged woman in the dirty scrubs, at the burn scars on her arm, at the grey hair. He looked confused. "Who are you, really?" Raker asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because nurses don't have level 5 security flags. Spies do. Terrorists do. Dead people do." Elara looked up, her eyes dry and hard. The mask was gone. There was no point in playing the timid agency nurse anymore. "I need to make a phone call," she said. Her voice was different now. The tremble was gone. It was the voice that had commanded the trauma room. "You don't get a phone call," Raker said. "Not with a flag like this. I have federal agents en route. They'll be here in 20 minutes. Until then, you sit there and you tell me why a Navy SEAL is alive because of you, and why the hospital wants to bury you for it." "The hospital wants to bury me because I embarrassed a man with an ego larger than his skill set," Elara said calmly. "But that doesn't matter. You need to listen to me, detective. If the people coming for me are who I think they are, you are in danger just by sitting in that chair." Raker laughed, a short, nervous bark. "I'm a cop in a precinct full of cops. I think I'm safe from the nurse lady." "They aren't cops," Elara said, leaning forward until her forehead touched the cold steel bars. "And I'm not a nurse." The station door buzzed. Raker turned. 2 men in dark suits walked in. They didn't look like FBI. They didn't look like local feds. They moved with a predatory grace that Elara recognized instantly. They scanned the room, ignoring the desk sergeant, their eyes locking onto the holding cell in the back. Elara closed her eyes. It wasn't the FBI. It was the cleanup crew. "Detective Raker," the taller of the 2 suits called out. "We'll take it from here. Step away from the prisoner." The correct answer had been seen. The correct answer had saved a life. But now, the correct answer was about to be erased. The silence in the holding cell was heavier than the steel bars. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the suffocating pressure before a detonation. Detective Raker stood his ground, one hand hovering near his holster, his eyes darting between the 2 men in suits and the woman sitting on the metal bench. "I told you," Raker said, his voice trembling slightly. "The paperwork isn't processed. You don't take a prisoner out of my precinct without a judge's signature, federal agent or not." The lead suit, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow and dead, shark-like eyes, didn't look at Raker. He looked at Elara. He looked at her like she was a package to be incinerated. "Detective," the man said, his voice flat and bored. "This isn't a police matter anymore. This is a containment issue. Step aside, or your pension won't be the only thing you lose tonight." Elara sat perfectly still. Her head was bowed, but her eyes were open. She was listening to the rhythm of their breathing. She was calculating the distance between the cell door and the desk. She was assessing the threat level. These weren't federal agents. They stood too close together. They checked their watches too often. They were contractors. Cleanup. "You're not FBI," Elara said. Her voice was soft, but it carried a resonance that made the air vibrate. It was the voice of someone who was done hiding. The lead suit turned his head slowly. "Quiet. Vance. FBI agents wear cheap suits and expensive shoes," Elara continued, lifting her head. Her grey eyes were no longer dull. They were burning with a cold, terrifying intelligence. "You wear tailored suits and combat boots. You smell like gun oil and mints. Your private sector. Which firm? Blackwood? Cerberus?" The second suit twitched. A micro-expression of surprise. That was all Elara needed. "Raker," Elara said, shifting her gaze to the detective. "These men are going to kill me, and then they are going to kill you to cover it up. If you open that cell door, you are signing both our death warrants." "Shut her up," the lead suit commanded. He reached into his jacket, not for a badge, but for a suppressed pistol. Raker's eyes went wide. He fumbled for his own weapon, but he was slow, a beat cop in a sleepy precinct, unprepared for the wolves standing in his office. "Hey," Raker shouted. "Hands where I can." The lead suit moved with professional speed, backhanding Raker across the face with the heavy barrel of the pistol. The detective crumbled, hitting the floor with a sickening thud, blood spraying from his nose. The cell keys skittered across the floor, landing just outside the bars. The lead suit picked them up. He looked at Elara through the bars. There was no Miranda warning, no procedure, just the cold efficiency of an executioner. He jammed the key into the lock. Click. The door swung open. "Get up," the man said, raising the gun. Elara stood up. She didn't cower. She didn't beg. As she rose, the slump in her shoulders vanished. The limp in her right leg disappeared. She stood at her full height, 5'9" of coiled steel. "You made a mistake," Elara said. "Move," the man spat. Elara took a step forward, hands still cuffed behind her back. As she passed the threshold, the man reached out to grab her arm. She moved. It wasn't a struggle. It was geometry applied to anatomy. Elara stepped into his guard, dipping her shoulder. She spun, using her hips to slam her cuffed hands into the man's groin with the force of a sledgehammer. As he doubled over, gasping for air, she pivoted, bringing her heel down onto the instep of his boot, crushing the small bones of the foot. The gun clattered to the floor. The second suit lunged. Elara dropped to her knees, sweeping his legs with a rotational kick that defied her age. He hit the concrete hard. Before he could scramble up, she was on him. She didn't have hands, so she used her knees. She dropped her full body weight onto his carotid artery, pinning him to the floor, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. "Raker!" Elara shouted, the command snapping the dazed detective back to reality. "The gun! Get the gun!" Raker, dazed and bleeding, scrambled on all fours. He grabbed the suppressed pistol just as the first man began to rise, a knife now in his hand. "Stay down," Raker screamed, leveling the weapon with shaking hands. "Stay the hell down." The room froze. Two highly trained contractors were down, one unconscious, one crippled, neutralized by a handcuffed middle-aged woman in under 6 seconds. Elara stood up slowly. She looked down at the unconscious man beneath her, then turned her back to him, presenting her bound wrists to the detective. "Uncuff me, detective," she said. "We don't have much time." They didn't come alone. Back at Saint Jude's, the atmosphere in the VIP suite was suffocatingly polite. Dr. Thorne was explaining the recovery timeline to a room full of hospital administrators, basking in the glow of his success. Commander Kincaid wasn't listening. He was staring at the tablet in his lap. He had made a call to a contact in naval intelligence, a favor owed from a darker time in Syria. He had asked for a background check on a nurse named Elara Vance. The email had just come through. Subject: Vance, Elara. No records found. Body: Commander. The name is a ghost. Social security number belongs to a woman who died in 1998. But I ran the facial recognition from the hospital security feed you sent. Kincaid scrolled down. The image loaded slowly. It wasn't a driver's license photo. It was a grainy, black and white classified file photo. The woman in the picture was younger, her hair dark, her face harder, but the eyes were the same. Identity, match found. Name, CPT, Elara Vance. Designation, U.S. Army. Former. Unit, ISA. Intelligence, support activity, the activity. Status, killed in action, Afghanistan, 2014. Kincaid stopped breathing for a second. The ISA, the activity. They were the ghosts of the Special Operations world. They were the ones who went in before the SEALs, before Delta, to pave the way with intelligence and surgical violence. They were the best of the best, and they didn't exist on paper, and she was supposed to be dead. "Commander?" Thorne asked, noticing Kincaid's intensity. "Is everything all right?" Kincaid looked up at the doctor. The contempt he felt for the man in the white coat was now mixed with a terrifying realization. Thorne hadn't just insulted a nurse, he had insulted a ghost who had come back from the dead. "Thorne," Kincaid said, his voice low and dangerous. "You called the police on her. Who else knows she's here?" Well, risk management notified the authorities." Thorne stammered. "Why?" "Because," Kincaid said, ripping the IV line out of his arm, ignoring the spray of blood and the alarms that instantly began to wail. "If you put a woman like that in a cage, you don't get justice. You get a war." He swung his legs over the side of the bed. The pain in his shattered leg was blinding, white-hot agony that made his vision swim. He gritted his teeth, forcing the scream down into his gut. "Commander, what are you doing?" Thorne shrieked, rushing forward. "You can't walk. You'll destroy the reconstruction." Kincaid grabbed Thorne by the lapels of his pristine white coat and pulled him close. "Get me my clothes," Kincaid snarled, "and get me a phone that isn't tapped. Now." The repressed power in the room wasn't just in the recovering SEAL. It was in the truth that was slowly dawning on everyone. The quiet nurse wasn't a victim of the system. She was a weapon the system had lost. And now, the system was trying to destroy the evidence, but they had forgotten one thing. Weapons don't go quietly. The metal cuffs hit the floor with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent precinct. Detective Raker's hands were shaking so bad he could barely holster his weapon. He looked at the two unconscious men in suits, then at the woman rubbing her wrists. She didn't look like a nurse anymore. She didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a soldier, inspecting the perimeter. "We have 3 minutes," Elara said. She knelt by the lead contractor, the one with the crushed foot. She patted him down with practiced efficiency, ignoring Raker's horrified stare. She pulled a encrypted radio from his belt, a spare magazine, and a set of car keys. 3 minutes? Raker stammered, wiping blood from his nose. "Until what?" "Until the QRF, Quick Reaction Force, realizes these two haven't checked in," Elara said, standing up. She checked the load in the magazine. "Then they send a team to level this building. We need to be gone." "Level the building?" Raker laughed. A high-pitched, hysterical sound. "This is a police station. You can't just attack a police station in the middle of the city." Elara looked at him. Her eyes were sad. "Detective, the people who sent these men erase governments. A precinct in a strip mall is nothing to them. You need to go home, get your wife, get your kids, and drive 3 states away. Do not use your credit cards. Do not use your phone." I can't just leave," Raker whispered. "This is my job." "Your job is over," Elara said softly. "Your life is what you're trying to save now." She turned to the door, but stopped. The radio in her hand crackled. "Team leader, status, package secured, over." Elara stared at the device. If she ran now, she could disappear. She knew the tradecraft. She could hit a cache she buried in a park 3 years ago, get a new passport, and vanish into the Canadian wilderness before sunrise. She had done it before, but if she ran, they would kill Raker, and they would go back to the hospital to finish what they started with Kincaid, because Kincaid had seen her. Kincaid knew, and a loose end like a Navy SEAL isn't left dangling. She had saved his life with a needle. Now, that act of mercy was demanding a payment she couldn't afford. She pressed the transmit button. "Team leader is indisposed," Elara said, her voice dropping into a flat, icy cadence. "The package is gone. Come and find me." She released the button and looked at Raker. "Now they're coming for me. Run, detective. Run fast." Elara burst out the back door into the alleyway, the cold night air biting at her exposed arms. 5 miles away, the pain was a living thing. It was a white-hot iron rod driven through Breaker Kincaid's thigh. He was in the parking garage of Saint Jude's. He was wearing a stolen janitor's jumpsuit that was 3 sizes too small, the fabric straining against his broad shoulders. He was leaning heavily on a metal crutch he had swiped from the physical therapy supply closet. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. His vision blurred at the edges. The post-op painkillers hadn't kicked in, or maybe he had burned through them with pure adrenaline. He reached the black SUV parked in the reserved slot marked Dr. A. Thorne. Kincaid smashed the driver's side window with the handle of the crutch. The glass shattered. He unlocked the door and dragged himself inside, his bad leg screaming in protest as he maneuvered it under the steering column. He didn't hotwire it. He didn't have to. Thorne, in his arrogance, had left the valet key in the glove box. Kincaid started the engine. The dashboard lit up, casting a blue glow on his sweating face. He grabbed the phone he had taken from the nurse's station, a burner he had swiped from a distracted orderly. He dialed a number. Not the police, not the Navy. He dialed the number on the business card he had found in the wallet of the risk management woman, Mrs. Vesson, before he slipped out of his room. It rang twice. "Vesson," the crisp voice answered. "You missed," Kincaid growled. There was a pause on the other end. A long, heavy silence. "Commander Kincaid," Vesson said, her tone shifting from corporate to cold. "You should be in bed. You're risking an embolism, and you're risking a war," Kincaid said, reversing the car out of the spot, his tires squealing on the concrete. "I know who she is. I know who Elara Vance was, and I know you sent a cleanup crew to the precinct. She is a liability, Commander. A ghost that refuses to stay buried. She compromised a classified timeline just by existing. And you are becoming a complication. Call them off," Kincaid ordered. "I can't do that," Vesson replied smoothly. "The algorithm has already executed the containment protocol. The assets are in motion. If you interfere, you become part of the cleanup." "I'm already part of it," Kincaid said. "I'm coming for her, and if you touch her, I will bring the entire Trident community down on your head. I will make Benghazi look like a training exercise. You can't save her, Breaker. She's already dead. She died in 2014. We're just correcting a clerical error." The line went dead. Kincaid threw the phone onto the passenger seat. He slammed his foot on the gas. The SUV roared, tearing out of the garage. He didn't know where the precinct was. He didn't know the city, but he knew tactics. If Elara Vance was the operator the file said she was, she wouldn't stay at the kill zone. She would move to a choke point. She would find high ground or a defensive position. He turned on the police scanner app he had downloaded on the way to the car. Shots fired at the 4th precinct. Officer down. Suspect is a female, fleeing south on Industrial. Pursuing vehicle is a black van. South, Industrial District. The old rail yards. Kincaid gritted his teeth, fighting the black spots dancing in his vision. She was leading them away from civilians. She was drawing fire. He drifted the heavy SUV onto the main avenue, ignoring the red lights. "Hang on, Elara," he whispered to the windshield. "Just hang on." Elara was driving a sedan she had requisitioned from the impound lot keys she took from the contractor. She wasn't driving fast. She was driving precisely. Behind her, 2 black vans were closing the distance. They weren't using sirens. They were using tactical floodlights, blinding her mirrors. Bullets impacted the trunk of her car. Thwack, thwack, thwack. She didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the road. She was heading for the Miller Street Bridge. It was a bottleneck. Narrow lanes, high walls. If she could get there, she could neutralize their numbers advantage. But the car was sluggish. The engine whined. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The grey hair, the wrinkles around her eyes. She wasn't Captain Vance anymore. She didn't have the stamina she had at 30. Her hands were tired. Her heart was tired. For 10 years, she had lived in silence. She had scrubbed floors and emptied bedpans and taken the abuse of arrogant doctors, all to pay penance for the mission that went wrong in Kabul, the mission where she had made the call that killed her team. She had sworn never to hold a weapon again. She had sworn to only heal. And now, because she couldn't let a boy die on a table, she was driving a stolen car into a firefight. A round shattered the back windshield, showering the back seat in glass. Elara swerved, clipping a parked car, correcting the skid. She saw the bridge ahead. But she also saw something else. A third van blocked the entrance to the bridge. They had boxed her in. Smart, she murmured. Flanking maneuver. She slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt in the middle of the empty industrial road. The 2 vans behind her stopped, fanning out. Men poured out, weapons raised. Elara opened her door. She stepped out into the rain. She had 1 pistol, 1 magazine, 12 rounds. There were 8 men. She raised the gun. She didn't tremble. "Come on then," she whispered, just as the first contractor raised his rifle. A roar filled the air. Not a siren. An engine. A V8 engine pushed to its breaking point. Thorne's black SUV came flying out of a side alley, airborne for a split second. It didn't brake. It didn't swerve. It T-boned the lead van with the force of a freight train. Metal screamed. Glass exploded. The van flipped onto its side, crushing the men seeking cover behind it. The SUV spun out, steam hissing from its crushed radiator, coming to a rest 10 feet from Elara. The driver's door kicked open. Breaker Kincaid fell out. He didn't step out. He fell. He hit the asphalt, dragged himself up using the doorframe, and leveled a Glock 19 over the hood of the car. He looked at Elara. His face was gray with pain, sweat dripping off his nose, his hospital gown torn, his leg a bloody ruin of bandages. But his eyes were steady. "You're a hard woman to find, nurse," Kincaid wheezed. Elara stared at him. "You should be in the ICU. And you," Kincaid racked the slide of his pistol, aiming at the remaining contractors who were scrambling for cover. "Should have checked my airway sooner." They stood there, in the rain. The ghost and the broken seal, outnumbered, outgunned. And for the first time in 10 years, Elara didn't feel alone. The rain didn't wash away the blood. It just made it slick. The industrial district of the rail yard was a canyon of rusted steel and wet asphalt. Bullets hammered against the side of Thorne's stolen SUV, a rhythmic, deafening drumbeat of lead against metal. Sparks showered down on Breaker Kincaid's head as he crouched behind the front wheel well, firing 2 controlled shots over the hood. "Contact front!" Kincaid roared, his voice straining against the agony in his leg. 2 moving left. They're flanking. Elara didn't shout. She slid across the wet pavement, staying low, using the engine block as a shield. She didn't look like a woman in her 50s anymore. The pain in her joints was gone, replaced by a cold, familiar clarity. The ghost wasn't just a nickname the nurses used to mock her. It was a classification. She popped up, her pistol extended in a 2-handed grip. She didn't aim. She pointed. It was muscle memory from a life she thought she had buried in the desert sand. Crack, crack. A shadow moving near the flipped van crumpled. "One down," she said calmly, ducking back down as a spray of automatic fire chewed up the pavement where her head had been a second before. She looked at Kincaid. He was in bad shape. The adrenaline that had carried him out of the hospital was burning off, leaving behind the raw, catastrophic reality of his injuries. His makeshift bandages were soaked through. The reconstruction Thorne had performed was tearing apart with every move. His face was the color of old ash, his eyes glassy. "You're bleeding out," Elara said, her hand instinctively reaching for his leg. Kincaid slapped her hand away. "Focus on the shooters, Doc. Fix me later." "There is no later if you go into hypovolemic shock," she countered, her voice hard. "You have maybe 5 minutes of consciousness left. Then let's make them count." Kincaid grimaced, changing his magazine. His hands were steady, but his breathing was a ragged wheeze. "They're pinching us. The van at the bridge has a heavy machine gun. If they open up, this SUV turns into Swiss cheese." Elara scanned the perimeter. He was right. The third van, the one blocking the bridge, had deployed a shooter with an LMG. They were waiting. They were pinning them down so the flankers could close in for the kill. It was a classic hammer and anvil. And Kincaid was the anvil. He couldn't move. He was a stationary target. Elara looked at her pistol. Slide lock. Empty. She reached for the spare magazine she had taken from the contractor at the station. It was her last one. 15 rounds. 15 rounds against 4 highly trained operators and a heavy machine gun. "Breaker," Elara said softly. He looked at her. For a moment, the gunfire seemed to fade. In the harsh glare of the tactical lights, cutting through the rain, he saw her. He didn't see the agency nurse who cleaned bedpans. He saw the officer she had been. He saw the weight of command, the burden of decisions that cost lives. "You can't walk," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I can shoot," he rasped. "Not if they flank you. You're a sitting duck." Elara checked the load in her pistol, sliding the magazine home with a sharp click. "The only way you survive this is if they look somewhere else." Kincaid's eyes narrowed. He knew that tone. He had heard it before, over radios in bad places, from men who knew they weren't coming home. "Don't do it," Kincaid growled. "Don't you dare. My career is over," Elara said, a sad, crooked smile touching her lips. "Elara Vance died the minute I put that needle in your chest. I'm just a ghost now, and ghosts are hard to kill." "Adara!" Kincaid shouted, using her real name for the first time. She didn't answer. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, the shift schedule she had carried for 2 weeks. She crumpled it and dropped it in a puddle, the last remnant of her normal life, dissolving in the dirty water. "Cover me," she ordered. Before Kincaid could grab her, Elara moved. She didn't run away from the fire. She didn't run toward the bridge. She broke cover, sprinting laterally into the open darkness of the rail yard, heading toward a rusted labyrinth of shipping containers. "Target moving!" a voice screamed from the darkness. "Suppress her. It's the primary. Take her." The hammer fell. The heavy machine gun on the bridge roared to life, a chainsaw sound that tore the night apart. Tracers zipped through the rain, chasing Elara's silhouette. Kincaid screamed in rage. He pulled himself up over the hood, ignoring the fire in his leg, and unleashed hell. He fired rapidly, dangerously, exposing himself to draw attention back to him, but the contractors took the bait. They knew who the high-value target was. It wasn't the crippled SEAL. It was the woman who knew too much. Elara dove behind a stack of steel beams as concrete exploded around her. She was breathing hard, her heart slamming against her ribs. She was 40 yards away from Kincaid now. She had successfully split the fire, but she had also trapped herself. She could hear boots splashing in the puddles. They were closing in on her position. She could smell their mints and gun oil. She pressed her back against the cold steel. She had 6 rounds left. She closed her eyes for a second. She thought about the quiet rhythm of the night shift, the beep of the monitors, the smell of antiseptic, the simple, noble work of keeping people alive. She had loved that life. She had loved the anonymity. She had lost it all to save one man. And looking at Breaker Kincaid, who was still firing desperately to protect her, she realized she would make that trade again. "Come out, Vance," a voice echoed from the other side of the beams. "It's over. There's nowhere to go." Elara opened her eyes. They were gray and empty of fear. She looked up. Above the beams, a massive crane hook dangled, swaying in the wind, and next to it, a junction box for the yard's high-voltage floodlights. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She was an operator, and operators use the environment. She raised her pistol, aiming not at the men, but at the ceramic insulators on the junction box 20 feet above the approaching team. "It's not over," she whispered. "Until I say it is." She squeezed the trigger. Bang! The insulator shattered. The high-tension cable snapped, whipping down like a lash of lightning. It didn't hit the ground. It hit the wet steel rails the contractors were standing on. Zazab! A blinding blue flash lit up the entire yard, brighter than the sun. The sound was a crack of thunder that shook the ground. The 3 men closing in on her convulsed as 10,000 volts surged through the standing water and the conductive rails. They dropped instantly, unconscious or dead, smoke rising from their gear. The yard plunged into darkness as the floodlights blew out. Silence returned, heavy and ringing. Elara slumped against the beam, gasping for air. She had neutralized the flankers, but the heavy gunner on the bridge was still there, and she was out of ammo. She heard a sound, a low, rhythmic thumping, not a heartbeat. Rotors. The sound grew louder, vibrating in her chest. A spotlight cut through the clouds, searching the ground. Elara looked up. It wasn't a medevac. It wasn't the police. It was a Navy MH-60 Seahawk, blacked out, flying low and fast. She froze. Friend or foe? Vesson had said the assets were in motion. Was this the cleanup crew, or had Kincaid's threat to bring down the Trident community actually worked? The helicopter hovered over the bridge, the downdraft flattening the rain. The side door gunner opened up, the minigun spinning with a terrifying hum. But he didn't fire at Elara. He fired at the van blocking the bridge. The vehicle was shredded in seconds, the heavy machine gun silenced in a hail of brass. The chopper banked, turning toward the rail yard. Elara stood up, her empty hands raised. She was done fighting. The helicopter hovered over the spot where Kincaid lay slumped against the SUV. Ropes dropped. Men in full kit fast roped down, moving with a speed that made the contractors look like amateurs. They surrounded Kincaid. Elara watched from the darkness. She saw them check him. She saw them load him onto a litter. Then one of the operators turned. He had night vision goggles flipped down. He looked directly at where Elara was hiding. He raised his hand and waved her in. She hesitated. If she walked into that light, Elara Vance was gone forever. She would be debriefed. She would be processed. She would be thrown back into the machine she had spent a decade escaping. She looked at the empty tracks leading out of the yard. She could still run. In the chaos, she could slip away. Then she saw Kincaid on the stretcher. He was conscious. He was pointing at her, shouting something at the rescue team, refusing to leave. He wouldn't leave her behind. Elara took a deep breath. The rain ran down her face, washing away the grime. She stepped out from behind the beams and walked toward the light. The ride in the MH-60 Seahawk was a deafening transition between two worlds. One moment, Elara was standing in the rain, a hunted animal in dirty scrubs. The next, she was strapped into a jump seat, surrounded by the latest generation of the Brotherhood she had left behind. Kincaid lay on a litter secured to the floorboard. The flight medic, a kid who looked no older than the boy who had died on Thorne's table, was working on his leg. Kincaid didn't look at the medic. He kept his eyes locked on Elara. He reached out a hand, his grip weak but insistent. Elara took it. Her hand, rough with calluses from scrubbing floors, disappeared into his heavy, trembling palm. There were no words. The roar of the rotors and the whine of the transmission made speech impossible, but the vibration of the airframe felt like a heartbeat they shared. They didn't fly to a military base. Kincaid, in his delirium, had given a specific order before he passed out. Saint Jude's. He refused to be treated anywhere else. He wanted the witnesses to see the end of the play. The helicopter descended onto the roof of the trauma center, the downwash blowing the wind socks horizontal. The landing lights painted the helipad in harsh, white brilliance. The doors slid open. This time, Dr. Aris Thorne was waiting. He was flanked by the hospital administrator, Mrs. Vesson from risk management, and a phalanx of security. They looked angry. They looked ready to regain control of their facility from the lunatic nurse and the rogue patient. But as the rotors spun down, they didn't step forward. They stepped back, because Elara didn't step out in handcuffs. 2 Navy operators in full combat gear hopped out first, establishing a perimeter with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Then, the flight medic and a crew chief unloaded Kincaid. And finally, Elara emerged. She walked with a limp, her scrubs torn, wet, and stained with grease and mud. Her hair was matted against her skull. She looked like a wreck. But a tall man in a dress uniform, a rear admiral who had arrived on a separate chopper minutes earlier, walked past Thorne, past Vesson, and walked straight to Elara. Thorne stepped forward, his ego unable to read the room. "Admiral, I need to protest. That woman is a danger to my patients. She assaulted staff, she stole a vehicle, and she—" The admiral didn't look at Thorne. He didn't even blink. He simply raised his hand, cutting the doctor off with a gesture of absolute dismissal. The admiral stopped in front of Elara. The wind whipped his coat. He looked at the scars on her arm, then up at her grey eyes. "Captain Vance," the admiral said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden silence of the rooftop, it carried like a bell. "We stopped looking for you 6 years ago. We thought you were dust." "I was," Elara said, her voice raspy. "I liked being dust." "You saved a Trident asset," the admiral said, glancing at Kincaid, who was being wheeled past them. "But you broke the terms of your exit. You know what that means." Elara looked past the admiral. She saw Nurse Jana standing by the door, hand over her mouth, eyes wide. She saw the security guard she had disabled, nursing his arm, looking at her with fear. She saw Thorne, his face draining of color as the reality of the situation finally pierced his arrogance. They weren't looking at the ghost anymore. They were looking at a predator they had mistaken for prey. They were realizing, with a sinking, nauseating dread, that they had treated a lioness like a stray dog. "I know what it means," Elara replied softly. "You can't go back to the apartment, Adara," the admiral said gently. "The identity is burned. Elara Vance is dead. The quiet life, it's over. You come with us, or you go to a cell. Those are the only 2 doors left." Elara looked down at her hands, the hands that had cleaned vomit, held dying strangers, and scrubbed the floors of men like Thorne. She had built a sanctuary of silence. She had found a way to forgive herself for her past by serving in the humblest way possible. That sanctuary was gone. The anonymity she cherished, the ability to be no one, to be invisible, was the price she had paid for Breaker Kincaid's life. She looked at Kincaid. He had stopped the gurney. He was twisting his neck to look at her, his eyes pleading. He knew what she was losing. He knew that for a covert operator, fame is a death sentence, and reactivation is a prison. "Don't do it," Kincaid wheezed. "Fight them," Elara smiled. It was a sad, tired smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. "It's okay, Breaker," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. She turned to the admiral. She slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out her hospital ID badge. The plastic clip was broken. The photo was unflattering. It just said Vance, nurse assistant. She ran her thumb over the word nurse. She looked at Thorne one last time. His tension pneumothorax was caused by the blast wave, she said to the doctor, her voice devoid of anger, filled only with a crushing, professional fatigue. "Next time, doctor, listen to the silence. That's where the patient is telling you what's wrong." Thorne opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He stood small and shrinking in his white coat, surrounded by men and women whose boots he wasn't fit to shine. Elara dropped the badge on the ground. It clicked against the concrete. "I'm ready, Admiral," she said. The Admiral nodded. He gestured toward the waiting helicopter. Elara walked toward the aircraft. She didn't look back at the skyline of the city she had lived in. She didn't look back at the sunrise, beginning to bleed over the horizon. She walked with her back straight, the limp disguised by sheer will. She climbed into the dark belly of the machine. The doors slid shut, sealing her away from the world. The rotors spun up, whipping the air into a frenzy. The helicopter lifted off, banking sharp and hard, turning away from the hospital, away from the life she had built, carrying the woman who didn't exist back into the shadows where she belonged. On the roof, the staff of Saint Jude stood in the wind. The badge lay at Dr. Thorne's feet. Jana bent down and picked it up. She looked at the cheap plastic, then at the empty sky where the helicopter had vanished. Who was she? Jana whispered. Thorne stared at the horizon, the shame finally settling in his gut like a stone. I don't know, Thorne murmured, his voice trembling. I never asked. The hospital returned to its rhythm. The alarms beeped, the stretchers rolled. But in the break room, the chair in the corner where the quiet nurse used to sit remained empty. Nobody moved it, nobody sat in it. It stayed there, a silent monument to a truth they had learned too late, that the most powerful people in the room are often the ones who don't feel the need to speak, and that by the time you realize a hero is walking among you, they are usually already walking away. Thank you for listening to this story.